Good morning, superheroes, and welcome back to mission briefing number 2. We are going to continue our lesson on force and motion. So, what I need for you to do is to go into your Google Classroom and click on the link to complete today's warm up entitled Warm Up. Remember that all answers must be in complete sentences. Your scores are subject to change based on a manual review of your answers later today, so do not fear. I have typed in an answer to give you a response back after you submit your warm up, but I will go back in and manually score those. So please do not fear what your score turns out to be when you submit it. So pause the video now to go do that. Okay, so welcome back. When we spoke about motion, we defined it as a change in an object's position. So look at Superman. We can see his position changing by looking at the reference point of the symbol. He starts off back towards the symbol, and as his motion changes, his position changes, he gets closer to us in reference to the symbol. So remember that a frame of reference must be recognized and defined, and observation data must be obtained within that frame. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, remember that once the frame of reference or the reference point is established, the location of the object within that frame can be described. An object's location is referred to as its position. And remember, the symbol used to represent position is X. So if we recall from mission briefing 1, we defined distance as D equals XF minus XI. The X standing for position, F meaning final, I meaning initial. So the next question that arises in an inquiry about motion is how far? Well, we talked about distance, but to add to this dimension, we have to introduce linear measurement into our conception of movement. And linear meaning line, okay? We will now report position in meters, centimeters, kilometers, or whatever units are consistent with the context that we're observing. So if we're wanting to measure the distance between your house and your favorite restaurant, we're going to use kilometers. If we want to measure the distance across a room, we're going to use meters. If we want to measure the distance between 2 points on a piece of paper, let's say for our assessment, we're going to use centimeters. Now, the change of position of an object is called displacement. So think about this. Look at this diagram. Let's say that all of this inside of here is a lake. And we park over here. So this is going to be XI, our initial position. And then we have to walk all the way around the lake to get to our favorite spot to fish, to picnic, to camp, to read a book, anything like that. So this is XF, the final position. Well, that overall path that we took, that is our distance traveled. But if we want to know how far apart our two spots are, the parking lot and our favorite spot, then we want to measure straight across. this would be the distance that we would actually travel if we could walk across the water. And that is what is called displacement. So in order to determine an object's displacement, we need to know the magnitude of the change of the position, that is, how far it moved and the direction in which it moved. Okay, I know it's still a little confusing, but let's keep going. So you have an understanding of what motion is because you have an understanding of the concepts of motion as it's defined, position, reference point, and distance. And now we have to look at this other concept of motion, which is displacement. So here is the definition for displacement. Displacement is a vector. That means it has direction and magnitude. Magnitude meaning change, whose length is the shortest distance from the initial position to the final position of an object in motion. So, have you ever heard anyone say the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line? Or maybe you've heard them say something, which is usually our grandparents, and they'll say something like, well, as the crow flies. Well, what they're actually talking about is displacement. If we could travel from our house to grandma's house without having to drive on all the roads and take all those crazy curves and hills and stops and turns, then we could get there a lot faster. That's the actual distance between our house and grandma's house as the crow flies would be the straight line. But because we have to take the roads and we have to turn and make the curves and the ups and downs and the hills, then our actual distance that we travel is longer than what the 2 points are actually apart. Okay? If this is not making any sense, please make sure that you're posting questions in the Google Classroom under the assignment so that I can reference them for everyone. Okay, I know you're saying this. Okay, Ms. Stinson, we get it. Motion is the process of changing position. And position is where something is located. And the reference point, well, that's the starting point that we use to describe the object's position. And the distance, that's the difference between where it started, the initial position, and where it stopped, the final position, based on that reference point. And then the direction, well, that's the term we use to describe which way it traveled in respect to the reference point. And now we know what displacement is. Displacement is the shortest distance between those 2 points if we didn't have to take the scenic route. Okay? But, we've talked about what motion is. We know how to describe motion. We can use all of these terms and describe the motion of an object. But what is actually causing that object to be in motion? Okay, we'll start thinking about this. An object will speed up, slow down, or turn. We know this. We've seen it happen. So what's causing it? Why do they speed up, slow down, or change direction? Does anybody have an idea? Anybody? No? Well, okay. Well, I'll tell you. Well, the answer is force. And an object will speed up, slow down, or turn only. Notice how this is all caps and underlined. Only if something is pushing or pulling on it. Well, that's what a force is. A force is any push or pull. And it's also very, very important to remember that a force can be exerted in different ways. Now, I know you're asking yourself, Ms. Stinson, how is that possible? Well, we're going to explain. So, how do I know that a force is acting on an object? Well, in order to understand how the forces work, we have to understand a very important concept about force. And that is that more than one force can act on an object at the same time. Now, I know you're saying, well, how's that possible? How's that possible, Miss Denson? How can more than one thing be pushing and pulling on an object at the same time? Well, I want you to look at this example. Okay, so I have a magnet and I have the paper clip. Now, the magnet is exerting a force on the paper clip, trying to pull the paper clip to it. And then the paper clip is exerting a force on the magnet, trying to pull the magnet to it. My hands are pulling them apart and holding them up because gravity is trying to pull everything down. So we have a lot of forces going on here. So I have the force of the magnet trying to pull the paper clip. I have the force of the paper clip trying to pull the magnet. And I have the force of gravity trying to pull everything down. And then I have the force of my hands holding everything up. So when we think about it, we have 4 forces: hands, magnet, paper clip, gravity. Now, if I want to look at the net force of these objects, then let's say that I have a force of 1 for the magnet, a force of 1 for the paper clip, a force of 1 each for my hands, and then a force of gravity. So I have 1 for my hand, 1 for the magnet, so that's 2. 1 for my hand, 1 for the paper clip, so that's 2. And they're pulling in opposite directions. So now they're canceling each other out. So I have 2 newtons over here, 2 newtons over here, but they're canceling each other out. So 2 minus 2 equals 0 because there's no motion going on. Nothing's moving. If they were moving, then one of the other is exerting a greater force. Just like with gravity and my hands holding things up. If gravity were stronger right now, gravity would be pulling my hands down. But because I am holding things up, everything is canceling out. There's no motion in our system. So our net force equals 0. Okay, so I know that this still seems a little confusing, but let's look at it a little differently. So how does more than one force act on an object? Well, if you recall, we defined a force as any push or pull. That means that there are forces that are always pushing and pulling on an object. So in order for us to know how this is going to cause the object to behave or to move, we have to examine all of these forces. And the combination of all those forces acting on the object is called the net force. So think about this. You've heard people talk about, well, my gross income is this, but my net income is this. Well, what they're talking about is with the gross income, that is all the money that they worked for and that they made before taxes were taken out. And then the net income, well, that's what's left over after all those taxes are subtracted out. So that concept is basically the same thing for net force. The combination of all the different forces acting on the object are the net force, and that determines the motion of the object. So now think back to our example of the paper clip and the magnet that I showed you. The paper clip and the magnet didn't move. Therefore, the net force was 0. And this is because all the forces that were pushing and pulling on the paper clip and the magnet were in opposite directions and canceled each other out. So think about it this way. My hands were holding the magnet and the paper clip. they're holding them apart so that they couldn't pull towards one another. So those were being canceled out. And then gravity, we know gravity, it pulls everything to the ground. Well, my hands were holding the magnet and the paper clip up, so gravity couldn't pull it down. So my force of holding them up was canceling out gravity pulling them down. So there was no motion in the objects, so therefore the net force is 0. Okay, so I understand. You may still not get it. So it's a little confusing. So let's try looking at it this way. We know that when we want to know how much force there is acting on an object, we have to look at the net force. To know what the net force is, we have to combine all the forces acting on the object. So we have to combine. Well, okay, how do we do that? Well, that's where Miss Stinson comes in. So it's fairly easy. So all the forces that are acting in the same direction are going to be added together. Well, that makes sense. If they're going in the same direction, they can't be opposing one another, so we're going to add those together. All right, well, all the forces that are going in the opposite direction, those we're going to subtract. Okay, we're going to subtract those from the other ones. And then the direction that has the greater force or the higher number, that is the net force and the direction that the object will move. Okay, starting to make a little more sense here, Miss Stinson. Don't panic, guys. I got you. Okay, so let's take an example or look at a couple of examples as soon as Miss Stinson stops flipping through the screens. Okay, so I want you to imagine that you're throwing a ball. Your hand is exerting a force on that ball as it leaves your hand. But the ball is also pushing back on your hand. So the next time you're throwing a ball, I want you to really pay attention to how it feels. You can feel your hand exerting the force as it pushes away. And if you concentrate, you can feel the ball pushing back against your hand. Then, once it's left your hand, gravity starts to take over, and it causes its path to become curved down. Now, it doesn't happen immediately unless you don't put a lot of force in your throw. But if you watch it, it goes out so far, and then it starts to have that curve where gravity has taken over and is now pulling the ball back down. Then, when the ball hits the ground exerts another force on the ball, causing the ball to slow down and then eventually stop. Okay, so what about this one? What's going on here? Well, the car's just sitting still, and then the little boy gives it a little push, and it rolls. But notice that it stops because there's another force acting on it. Gravity is partially, but there's another force that we're going to discover later. Okay, we're going to talk about it later. So keep that in mind. There's all kinds of forces. Okay, so with the little bit of information that you have right now about how forces act, I want you to go back into your Google Classroom, and I want you to answer the questions that go along with this slide. So look at the two examples. In the top one, the two forces acting on the object are acting on different sides of the box. So we have 75 newtons pushing south and 50 newtons pushing east. So what is the net force acting on the box? Well, to calculate this, you have to remember the rules. Forces acting in the same direction are added together, and forces acting in opposite directions are subtracted. So with that in mind, go to the Google Classroom and open up the form that says, what is the net force? Okay. What is the net force? So pause the video now and go answer those questions. Okay, welcome back. Here is another example. Okay, so watch what is happening in the video. As you watch the video, pay close attention to what's happening, not just with the fruits, but also with the other things that you can see in the video. Okay, one more time. Okay, as we watched in the video, we had two cherries with forces acting in opposite directions. What did you notice that happened? I want you to pause the video, go to the Google Classroom, and answer the question under what happened in the cherry video, or it's probably going to say cherry video. Describe the motion and explain what is happening. Pause the video now. Okay, so that leads us to the two types of forces. So we have balanced forces and unbalanced forces. These again are vocabulary words, so make sure that you are familiar with them. So balanced forces are two or more forces exerted on an object that cancel each other's effects and do not cause a change in the object's motion. The net force is zero. So if you look at this graphic right here, it's like a scale. Notice how the trays on the scale are even. That means they're balanced. That means whatever we put in there, they're the same. They're canceling each other out, and the scale doesn't move. Okay, so unbalanced forces. Unbalanced forces are forces that do not cancel each other out, and the motion of the object changes. And the net force does not equal zero. So again, look at the scale. Notice now that one side is lower than the other. That means that there's more in this tray than there is in this tray, and it caused the scale, the motion of the scale to change. Because up here it was sitting still, it was balanced. Down here, it's unbalanced, and it caused a change. A force can act on an object without causing it to accelerate if other forces can cancel the push or pull of the force. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, think about this example. This has happened and you didn't even realize what was going on. So you and your friend are pushing on a door and it didn't move. So you're on the inside, they're on the outside, you're all being silly, playing around, and you don't want your friend to come in. So you're pushing on the door and your friend is pushing, trying to get in. But the door's not moving. That means that the two forces are equal, but they're in opposite directions. So therefore, they're canceling each other out. There's no motion to the door. So those would be called balanced forces. Okay, now think about that same example. You're pushing on the door, your friend's pushing on the door, they're pushing in, you're pushing it out to close it. And all of a sudden the door closes. That's because you now have more force than your friend does. So the forces are unbalanced and the door closes because of this change in force. Okay, so now we have unbalanced forces. Okay, so let's look at this next slide. Okay, in this video, I want you to watch closely what happens, and then I want you to be ready to explain what you see in the Google Classroom. Okay, so let's watch. Be ready to explain. Okay, so let's watch this video. I want you to be able to explain what you see on the form in the Google Classroom. Okay, so what did you notice that happened each time the person added another ball? Can you explain why that might have happened? Pause the video and go to the Google Classroom now. Okay, guys, great job. Thank you for paying attention and working through everything today. I want you to go back into your Google Classroom. There is an assignment title with today's date, 9/3 or 9/8, and it says exit slip. Click on the Google form and complete the questions. The required code is FORCE. Thank you, guys. See you next time.